Kent is well known for its cathedrals and its castles, a lasting reminder of its place in British history. But how much is known about the ordinary people that lived here, especially its multicultural past? It is known that people of African origin have been present in Kent for centuries. Certainly by the mid-16th century, some black inhabitants lived in Kent as a result of trade routes with the Mediterranean and African coasts. Professor David Killingray has spent his academic career writing and researching black history.
The earliest known settlers are probably 17th century, and they may have been born here, and they are the children of perhaps a black visitor, a black traveller, even a black settler coming to places like particularly Chatham, the Medway ports, Gravesend, and the environs of London, Deptford for example.
So who are these people and where did they come from? Well, early records show that in the 18th and 19th century, people from Africa and the Caribbean settled in Kent port towns like Dover, Sheerness and Gravesend, and even here in Chatham as well. One man who came to Medway from St Kitts was to marry a local woman at St Mary Magdalene Church in Gillingham in 1786. Their son, William Cuffey, was to become a key figure in the political movement which sought to improve the rights of British workers. The young William Cuffey trained as a tailor and he worked on Chatham High Street, and it was during this time that he started to become politically active.
He's put out of a job when there is a strike of tailors. This radicalises him. He goes to London, he's involved setting up a tailors' union there. He's then also attracted to the Charter. This was a demand for universal suffrage, annual parliaments, payment of members of parliament and so on. It's a radical reformist group at the heart of the British state. And in 1848, he's one of the organisers of the London Chartist organisation. He's involved in organising the Great March of 1848. He's arrested for sedition on ridiculous charges. But he is then convicted and sentenced to transportation. I think he's unusual in that, let's face it, most people did not stir up discontent.
Researchers working alongside the Chatham Historic Dockyard and the Medway African and Caribbean Association have been exploring records from Kent and Medway relating to William and his father, Chatham Cuffey.
We were looking into the sort of rich heritage of the dockyard workforce in the 18th, 19th century. One of the records that I was working on showed a list of the crew that was on there, and one of them was Chatham Cuffey, possibly a personal slave of one of the wealthy planters to actually come over here. And he seemed to have been accompanied by his mother. He arrived on a naval ship in about 1772, and he was baptised on arrival as Chatham Cuffey, presumably after the town he was taken in. In the records, he was described as a Negro man, aged about 17 at the time of his baptism. He lived in what's now, was known as New Brompton, which is now known as Gillingham, and he had 5 children, the eldest being William. Chatham Cuffey, he got him an apprenticeship as a tailor in Chatham. Again, it shows you his status. Chatham Dockyard also has links to another important figure in Kent's multicultural history. At the age of 14, Olaudah Equiano was the slave of a naval officer. He worked perilously on the gun decks of an 18th century naval warship called the Namur. These timbers are all that remain of the Namur, but Equiano's terrifying memoirs are recorded in his 1789 autobiography, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African.
making him one of the first black authors to be published in England. His experiences led to his involvement in the movement to abolish the slave trade in Britain and provided key evidence for the campaign.
So it's a very important book, and it's a very well written book. But he is a slave, he's owned by a British naval captain, and later on when he's bought his freedom, he serves on Royal Naval ships, even goes up to the Arctic. And then he settles in London in 1777, I think it is. And thereafter he's involved in the campaign against the slave trade. So he's a prominent black figure, along with other Africans in London. He's not alone in this. But there are also people that are influential who live in Kent, and particularly at Teesson. There are the Middletons who own Barham Court. They have the money, they have the connections, they know Wilberforce, they know other politicians. It's one of the cradles of British abolition, this small Kent village overlooking the Medway. And certainly Wilberforce goes there, Equiano's probably there, and they do talk about strategy. And they decide that they will introduce a bill into Parliament to bring to an end the slave trade.
After the 1807 Slave Trade Act was passed, it was the British Navy who were charged with enforcing it.
Now, after 1815, you have British naval patrols in the Atlantic, few in number, but they're trying to interfere with other nations trading in slaves, and the British are very keen. Once they have abolished the slave trade in Britain in 1807, the next big campaign is to end slavery within the British Empire.
It was Britain's involvement in policing the slave trade that was to save one young girl from near death as a slave in West Africa and bring her to a life of affluence and privilege in England and eventually Kent. This social club here was ironically home to a young woman with a very royal connection. Palm Cottage was once home to Sarah Forbes Bonetta, goddaughter of Her Majesty Queen Victoria. So how did she end up living here?
She's given as a gift to a British naval captain by the King of the Dahomians, a man called Gezo. And she's brought to Britain, and she is presented to Queen Victoria. She then agrees to financially support Sarah Forbes Bonetta. She's very well educated, she's a good pianist, she's a member of a middle class of black women in Britain. She's also in Kent because she stays with, he's a German clergyman. He has a succession of Africans and others, black people, coming to his house in Chatham.
I'm here to meet the great-great-grandson of Sarah, who can tell me a little bit more about his ancestors' past. I just hope he's in. Arnold!
Hi, how are you? Welcome. Because my grandmother used to talk about this ancestor of ours, who was the adopted daughter of Queen Victoria. But we never took her seriously. Thought it was an old lady rambling on. But so when I came about 10 years ago, I decided to check to see whether it's true or not. So I wrote to Windsor Castle, to the library there, and they said, yes, it is true. And they had a lot of information, photographs.
Arnold discovered that an officer from the Royal Navy had rescued her from slavery after the King of Dahomey was convinced to give her to the Queen of England as a gift, from one royal to another.
I didn't know I had any connection with Kent when I moved down here. I lived in London most of my life, working for the BBC. So I feel very close to Kent, although I'm not a man of Kent or Kentish man, but I'm adopted Kentish man now because I've lived here for 25 years. So I feel very close to Kent, and also the relationship that my ancestors had with Kent.
His ancestor was one of many black Britons who formed part of the middle classes.
And as the 19th century progresses, then London becomes the crossroads of empire. So Britain is often seen by black people as being a pleasant refuge. You could settle where you liked, you could marry across the race line, have books printed. So it's an irony of the British Empire that at the heart of empire you had greater freedoms than you had in the colony of origin.
Arnold's great-grandmother was not the only member of his family from Africa to become part of the British establishment.
My great-great-grandfather was Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowther. He also was a little slave boy who was captured in Oshogun, I think it was, and on the ship was on its way to South America when the slave trade was abolished, and the ship was captured by a British man-o-war, and they were all taken to Freetown. And he grew up there. He learned to read, learned the Bible, because they're all under missionaries, and eventually became a priest, and eventually became the first black bishop in the whole of the Anglican Communion. I knew that Bishop Crowther had a friend who, Reverend Shone, who lived in Palm Cottage in Gillingham. And he not only visited him there, but also Sarah Benita lived there in Palm Cottage for a while.
Although Arnold's ancestors are both very significant figures from Kent's Afro-Caribbean past, volunteer researchers are uncovering some lesser-known stories.
When we're trying to find about ordinary people who aren't famous, we tend not to have a lot of sources, and they tend not to tell us their ethnicity. So in the research for Black History Live, we've focused on the 18th and 19th century. Our researchers found stuff about a number of other people further down the social scale, but that give us the same sort of tale of integration. And I think one of the best for that is the story of Joshua Campbellton. He was born on the 10th of November, 1823, at Bermuda as a slave. At the age of 17, he joined the Royal Navy, and they immediately promoted him to petty officer. He rose to become a warrant officer in the Royal Navy. He then left the Navy in 1863, so at the age of 40. He came to Chatham Dockyard, where we are today. While he was here in Chatham, he married a local woman. So the story of Joshua Campbellton and his family shows that somebody who was born in slavery could join the Royal Navy, could rise far above the vast majority of the people who joined at the same time as him, and that he could be very much accepted, you know.
You just got to remember that obviously Chatham Dockyard, with the dockyard here, was the focal point. This is where everything came, you know, all the ships and that sort of thing. It was the growth area, because obviously we were looking at what life was like on the Age of Sail. There was an awful lot of black slave or black musicians. They were prized, obviously, to keep sailors and things happy along their voyage. They used to have orchestras and fiddle players and things like that. The Fish Jubilee singers came from, I think it was the south of America, but they were basically a gospel group that came to Chatham a number of times. There was two of them that actually came back because I think they met local women again, and one of them did set up home.
The Fisk Jubilee Singers were among many black entertainers which visited Kent during the 1800s, performing here in Rochester. The Corn Exchange played host to a man known as the African Marler, composer and conductor Samuel Coleridge Taylor. His gift for music emerged when he was very young, and by the time he was 15, he had won a scholarship to the Royal College of Music, counting Vaughan Williams and Holst as his contemporaries. In his time, Coleridge Taylor was described as a real genius. His seminal work, Song of Hiawatha, was a critical success. Now, thinking about it, I think it's fair to say that he was the toast of Edwardian musical society. In 1902, he went on to conduct the Rochester Choral Society. 2 years later, he took his composition Hiawatha's Wedding Feast to the US, meeting President Roosevelt and African-American leader Booker T. Washington. A century later, Black History Live is encouraging young people and the wider community to connect with Kent's black heritage through drama.
The play is called Black Heroes of Kent, and it's about all the people that came to Kent during like 1800s, 1900s, and just their stories and explaining their connections to the area. I played Ida B. Wells. Although she was from America, she did tours around the world, and so on these campaigns she went to England and she spoke out against lynching. This is a segment of a poem which was part of my scene that I did as Ida B. Wells. Sons and daughters of pharaohs gone by, will not our freedom be denied? A child of slavery, burning desire is to fight my case with ink and fire. Stand tall we will, with head held high, and ever so gently touch the sky. Just education, it's so important to have an understanding. Coming from a black background, I had somewhat of an understanding of the past my entire life, but it really shocked me how little my peers knew when I went to school, and even we didn't really have conversations about slavery or anything like that, and it will really help to shape people. And I think, especially in the world we live in now, it's so important to learn about everyone, because history is huge.
For you, how important do you think it is to recognise the black history we have here in Kent?
Well, it is important because it all happened down here, but the people of Kent don't know anything about it. So it's people like me to be able to educate them, to show them that this part of England had a very strong connection with blacks, the people from Africa who came to either to live in England or were brought here as slaves. But now they should know about it because their history is also bound up with my history.
It's vitally important that the history of individual black people comes into the common understanding of our collective history in the same way that people from all sorts of places, Pocahontas is part of our national history. Yeah, everyone should know Aina Sarah Forbes Burnett as much as they know, say, Pocahontas. I think that she should be part of the national conversation.
My dad's from London and my mum's from Jamaica, but I have only ever lived in Kent. I don't know anywhere else. So learning about the history here, it made me feel really proud. I was happy because I really felt a bit disconnected in that sense to the area. So learning that, it made me fall in love with the area even more than before.
We need more people to work on black history, I suppose, and particularly people from within the black community, because there's a whole history out there, the story of the common people, the people that you and I are, the ordinary people in our country.
We started this looking at a different side to Kent's history, and through it I found out a bit more about my Nigerian and Yoruba heritage. I guess it just goes to show if we delve a little deeper into our own histories, we might find a greater connection to the places we call home.